The blizzard had been raging for 3 days when the last log went into the fire, and the coals died 2 hours later. But inside Ezra Dalton's cabin, the temperature never dropped below 55 degrees, even though no flame had burned for the past 14 hours. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from, and if stories like this move you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's episode is even more unbelievable than this one. The winter of 1858 arrived in the Appalachian highlands with unusual severity. Ezra Dalton had lived in these mountains for 9 years, and he understood cold. He had survived winters that froze whiskey solid in the jug and turned breath to ice crystals in the air. But the blizzard that began on January 14th was different. It came with a wind that found every gap in every cabin and temperatures that dropped so low that sap froze inside living trees, causing them to split with sounds like rifle shots echoing through the forest. Ezra's cabin sat in a small clearing on the western slope of a ridge surrounded by oak and chestnut forest. He had built it himself 7 years earlier when he married Martha. The structure was solid by mountain standards. Log walls chinked with clay and moss, a stone fireplace, a door that closed tight, and shuttered windows. Inside lived Ezra, his wife Martha, and their 5-year-old son Augustus. They had supplies for winter: salted pork, cornmeal, dried beans, and a root cellar with potatoes and turnips. Most importantly, they had firewood. Ezra had cut and stacked 4 cords in October, enough for any normal winter. The blizzard made normal irrelevant. Snow began falling on the 14th and continued without pause for 6 days. Not the gentle snow of typical winter storms, but dense, heavy snow driven by winds that created drifts taller than a man. The temperature dropped to levels Ezra had never experienced. Going outside became genuinely dangerous. Exposed skin froze in minutes. Breathing the wind felt like inhaling knives. Even the short walk to the woodshed, only 20 feet from the cabin door, became an expedition that required wrapping every inch of skin and moving quickly. The fireplace consumed wood at a terrifying rate. To keep the cabin even marginally warm, Ezra had to maintain a large fire constantly. Every 3 hours, day and night, he went to the woodshed for more fuel. On the second day of the blizzard, he realized his carefully prepared supply was depleting faster than he had thought possible. By the 4th day, he was rationing, letting the fire burn lower, tolerating a colder cabin to stretch the remaining wood. By the 6th day, the woodshed was nearly empty. On the night of January 19th, Ezra burned the last split logs. He told himself the storm would break by morning. It had to. He built up the fire as large as he dared with the remaining wood, banked the coals carefully, and the family went to sleep under every blanket. They owned. Augustus slept between his parents for warmth. The wind howled against the cabin walls all night. Ezra woke near dawn to find the fire dead and the cabin bitterly cold. His breath was visible in the dim light. He could see frost forming on the interior walls near the corners where his chinking had gaps. Martha was still asleep, or so he thought. He touched her shoulder to wake her. Her skin was cold, not cool, but truly cold. He said her name. She didn't respond. He shook her gently, then harder. Augustus woke, confused by his father's urgency. Ezra pulled Martha close, trying to warm her with his own body heat, but he already knew. She had died during the night, her body temperature dropping below the point of survival while she slept. The storm finally broke on January 21st. Ezra buried Martha on the hillside behind the cabin, in ground so frozen he had to build fires on the earth for 2 days just to soften the soil enough to dig. Augustus stood silent during the burial, too young to fully comprehend, but old enough to understand his mother wasn't coming back. Neighbors from the scattered homesteads came to pay respects. Thomas Hewitt and his wife brought food. Silas Crawford offered to take Augustus for a few weeks. Ezra refused. He kept his son close and spoke very little. Spring came slowly to the mountains that year. Snow lingered in shaded hollows until late March. As the weather warmed and the forest came back to life, Ezra returned to the routines of mountain living. He worked his small cornfield, tended his vegetable garden, repaired winter damage to his fences, and cared for Augustus. To neighbors who visited, he seemed functional, but those who knew him well noticed something had changed. He was distracted, often staring at his fireplace for long periods lost in thought. The truth was that Ezra couldn't stop thinking about the night Martha died. He replayed it constantly in his mind. If he had brought in more wood the previous day, if he had woken during the night to rebuild the fire, if he had kept Augustus in the bed to generate more warmth for Martha. The guilt was crushing, but beneath the guilt was something else, a burning question that wouldn't leave him alone. Why was survival so completely dependent on maintaining a fire every single hour? Most mountain people accepted this reality without question. Fire was life. You maintained it or you died, simple as that. But Ezra couldn't accept it. There had to be a way to retain heat, to store warmth somehow so that a fire didn't need to burn constantly. He began paying obsessive attention to how heat behaved. He noticed that the stones of his fireplace stayed warm long after the fire died. Some stones stayed warm for hours. He started testing this, touching different stones at different times, trying to understand why some retained heat longer than others. In April, a traveling preacher passed through the settlement. The man carried a small collection of books he would lend to isolated families. Ezra borrowed 3 volumes. One was a history of ancient Rome. Ezra wasn't much for reading, but something caught his attention. A description of how wealthy Romans heated their homes using furnaces that warmed air beneath floors. The book called them hypocausts. Hot air from fires would flow through channels under stone floors, warming entire rooms without any fire visible in the living spaces. Ezra read the passage multiple times. The principle was simple. Heat traveled. If you could direct it through stone or earth, it would warm spaces far from the actual fire. And stone held heat. He began sketching crude diagrams on pieces of bark with charcoal. What if he could build something similar beneath his cabin floor, a chamber for heated stones that could radiate heat upward for hours? When Thomas Hewitt visited in May and saw the sketches, he gently suggested that Ezra might benefit from practical work rather than dwelling on ideas from old books. The concern in Hewitt's voice was clear. He thought grief had affected Ezra's mind. Summer arrived in the Appalachian highlands with the usual explosion of green growth and warm humidity. Most settlers focused on farming, the brief window of growing season demanding full attention. Ezra planted his corn and tended his garden, but his mind was elsewhere. He had become fixated on stones. Not just any stones, but specific types with particular properties. His neighbors noticed him spending hours examining rock outcroppings, breaking samples with his hammer, even heating stones in his fireplace and timing how long they stayed warm. Silas Crawford found him one afternoon in late June, 3 miles from his cabin, loading stones into a canvas sack. Crawford was a lean man in his 60s who had lived in these mountains longer than anyone else in the scattered community. He watched Ezra work for several minutes before speaking. "What in God's name are you doing, Dalton?" Ezra explained he was collecting limestone. Crawford looked at the pile of rocks, then at Ezra, then back at the rocks. "You walked 3 miles to collect stones? We got stones everywhere." Ezra tried to explain that different stones held heat differently, that limestone was particularly good for this purpose. Crawford listened with the expression of a man humoring someone whose mind had slipped. He clapped Ezra on the shoulder and walked away, shaking his head. But Ezra was right about the stones, even if he couldn't articulate the science precisely. Through systematic testing, he had discovered that limestone and certain types of sandstone retained heat far longer than granite or shale. He didn't know the technical reasons involving specific heat capacity and thermal mass. He simply knew that when he heated different stones in his fireplace to the same temperature and then removed them, the limestone stayed warm for hours while the granite cooled quickly. He needed limestone for the walls of his underground. chamber and dense sandstone for the heating stones themselves. Over the next month, Ezra made multiple trips to a limestone outcropping near a creek 3 miles south of his cabin. He selected pieces carefully, looking for stones that were relatively flat on at least 2 sides, pieces he could stack and fit together with minimal gaps. He carried them back to his cabin 20 or 30 pounds at a time. After a dozen trips, his neighbors started talking. Thomas Hewitt's wife mentioned to her husband that Ezra Dalton was hauling stones like a man building a castle. The sandstone proved harder to find. Ezra needed pieces of uniform size that could be heated repeatedly without cracking. Through trial and error, heating samples in his fireplace night after night, he learned that fine-grained sandstone with consistent coloring was most reliable. Coarse-grained pieces or stones with obvious layering would sometimes split when heated and cooled repeatedly. He needed several dozen stones of reliable quality. The search took him to different areas of the surrounding forest, always looking, always testing. By August, he had collected approximately 300 pounds of limestone and 150 pounds of sandstone, all hauled by hand over distances up to 5 miles. His son Augustus sometimes accompanied him on these expeditions, the boy not understanding why they were collecting rocks, but enjoying the time with his father. Other settlers who encountered them thought it strange, but harmless. The crazy grief had manifested as rock collecting, not dangerous, just peculiar. Late August 1858, Ezra began the work that would convince his neighbors he had truly lost his mind. He started removing floorboards from inside his cabin, not damaged boards that needed replacement, but perfectly good planks in the center of his main living space. Thomas Hewitt stopped by on a morning in early September and found Ezra on his knees prying up the 6th board. "What are you doing?" Hewitt asked, genuine alarm in his voice. Ezra said he was making space for a heating chamber. Hewitt stared at the growing hole in the floor, then at Ezra, then back at the hole. "You're tearing up your own floor?" Ezra nodded and kept working. Word spread quickly through the settlement. Silas Crawford made a special trip to see for himself. He arrived to find Ezra digging into the earth beneath where the floorboards had been, throwing soil out with a hand spade. Crawford watched for a full minute before speaking. "Dalton, you're digging a hole inside your house." Ezra paused, wiped sweat from his forehead, and confirmed that yes, he was digging a hole. Crawford shook his head slowly. "You're digging your own grave inside your house. That's what this looks like." He left without another word. But Ezra knew exactly what he was doing. The hole needed to be 18 inches deep, 20 inches wide, and 24 inches long, large enough to hold a significant mass of heated stones, but not so large that it would compromise the structural integrity of his cabin. He measured constantly as he dug, using a marked stick to check depth. The soil was a mix of clay and rock, difficult to excavate with hand tools. The work took 3 full days of steady digging. Once the excavation was complete, Ezra began constructing the stone walls. He had studied the limestone pieces he had collected, selecting the flattest and most regular for this purpose. He mixed mortar, using clay from a deposit near the creek, sand, and water. The proportions had taken him weeks to perfect through small test batches. Too much clay and the mortar cracked when it dried. Too much sand, and it didn't bind properly. He had finally achieved a mixture that was workable, strong and dried, without significant cracking. He laid the stones one at a time, spreading mortar between each layer, checking constantly that the walls remained vertical and the corners square. The work was painstaking. Each stone needed to be positioned carefully, sometimes adjusted multiple times before he was satisfied with the fit. After placing 5 or 6 stones, he would stop and let the mortar set partially before adding more weight above. Rushing would cause the lower stones to shift. Thomas Hewitt visited again during the 2nd week of construction. The stone walls were halfway complete, rising from the dirt like the foundation of a miniature building. Hewitt asked how long this project would take. Ezra said he didn't know. As long as it needed. Hewitt looked at Augustus, who was playing quietly in the corner, and asked if Ezra had thought about what he was teaching his son. Ezra said he was teaching him that some problems required new solutions. Hewitt left, shaking his head. By mid-September, the stone chamber was complete. The walls stood solid, mortared tight, and the interior space waited empty. But Ezra knew the chamber was only half the solution. Without a proper cover, heat would escape too quickly. The cover needed to seal the opening precisely, trapping warmth inside while allowing the heat to radiate upward through the wood at a controlled rate. Most men would have thrown together a few planks and called it finished. Ezra spent 2 weeks searching for a single tree. He walked the surrounding forest examining oaks, looking for specific characteristics. The tree needed to be old enough to have a wide diameter, at least 24 inches. The grain needed to be straight with no spiral twist. There could be no visible knots in the section he would cut. And the tree needed to be healthy, not partially rotted or damaged. He found several candidates but rejected each for various reasons. Too much taper, grain not straight enough, knots in the wrong location. Thomas Hewitt encountered him during this search, found him standing in front of a massive oak just staring at it. Hewitt asked what he was doing. Ezra said he was selecting a tree for the cover. Hewitt looked at the oak, then at several others nearby. They all looked the same to me. Just cut one down and get on with it. Ezra shook his head. This one had the right diameter, but the grain spiraled. That one had straight grain, but knots too close together. Hewitt threw up his hands. You're spending more time picking a tree than most men spend building an entire cabin. Ezra finally selected a white oak growing on a north-facing slope. The tree was approximately 80 years old based on its size, with a diameter of 28 inches at chest height. The section he needed showed perfectly straight grain visible in the bark pattern. He felled it carefully, cutting a notch on the side he wanted it to fall, then sawing from the opposite side until the tree dropped exactly where he intended. He limbed it and cut a 4-foot section from the straightest part of the trunk. Getting that section back to his cabin required building a drag sledge and 2 full days of hard pulling. Once home, he began the process of pit sawing a thick slab from the log. He dug a pit 4 feet deep near his cabin, positioned the log over it on sturdy supports, and worked alone with a long saw designed for one man to pull from below while the log stayed stationary. The work was exhausting. Each stroke of the saw removed a thin line of wood. The slab he needed was 2.5 inches thick. Cutting it free took 3 full days of sawing. With the slab cut, Ezra began the work of hand-planing it to exact dimensions. He had marked the measurements carefully, 20 inches by 24 inches, to fit within the lip frame he would build. Every edge needed to be square. Every surface needed to be smooth and flat. He worked with a hand plane, checking his progress constantly with a straight edge. The pile of wood shavings around his cabin grew steadily. October brought cooler weather to the mountains and the first hints of the coming winter. Ezra's cabin was scattered with wood shavings and tools as he worked on what neighbors considered the most baffling part of his entire project. He was building a frame to go around the hole in his floor. Not just any frame, but a structure that required the kind of precision joinery usually reserved for fine furniture. Thomas Hewitt visited on a cold morning and found Ezra carefully cutting a mortise into a piece of oak. "What is that?" Hewitt asked. Ezra explained it was part of the lip frame that would hold the cover. Hewitt looked at the mortise, barely an inch deep, cut with painstaking accuracy. "You've been working on that single piece for 2 days." Ezra nodded without looking up. The lip frame consisted of 4 pieces of oak, each 3 inches wide and 1 inch thick, that would form a raised border around the chamber opening. The corners needed to join with mortise and tenon joints, not simple butt joints that would weaken over time. Ezra cut each mortise by hand, using a chisel and mallet, removing tiny amounts of wood with each careful strike. The corresponding tenons on the mating pieces needed to fit snugly into these mortises. Too loose and the joint would fail. Too tight and the wood might split when fitted together. He worked on the first corner joint for 3 full days. Cut the mortise, test fit the tenon, mark where it was too tight, pare away a sliver of wood test again. The process repeated dozens of times until the tenon slid into the mortise with firm resistance, but no forcing required. When he finally achieved the fit he wanted, he started on the second corner. Silas Crawford stopped by during this work and watched Ezra test fitting joints. Crawford finally spoke. "You're spending 3 days on corners for a trapdoor frame. That's what you're doing with your time." Ezra said the frame needed to be perfect or heat would escape. Crawford asked why Ezra didn't just use nails like a normal person. Ezra explained that nails would loosen over time as wood expanded and contracted. These joints would stay tight for decades. Once all 4 corners were cut and fitted, Ezra assembled the frame dry without glue or pegs to check the overall fit. The frame formed a perfect rectangle with all corners square. He then carefully disassembled it and began the process of integrating it into his floor structure. The frame couldn't simply sit on top of the floor joists. It needed to be let into the joists so that it became part of the floor structure itself. He measured and marked each joist where the frame would sit, then used a chisel to cut shallow recesses. The frame would sit down into these recesses, flush with the top of the joists. The installation took another week. Each corner needed to be checked and rechecked for square. The frame needed to sit level in all directions. Once positioned correctly, he drilled holes through the frame and into the joists below, then drove wooden pegs through to lock everything in place. The pegs were made from seasoned hickory, driven tight, then trimmed flush. November 1858 brought the first serious cold to the mountains. Ezra finally completed the cover assembly in the last week of the month. The single-piece center panel sat within the reinforcing frame he had built around its edges. The darker oak frame pieces protected the edges and prevented warping. The entire assembly fit into the lip frame with less than 1/8 of an inch clearance on all sides. He had spent nearly 3 months on construction that most men would have finished in a week. The first test came on a cold night in early December. Ezra built up his fire and placed 6 sandstone blocks directly in the hottest coals. He let them heat for 2 hours until they glowed faintly in the dim light. Using a pair of iron tongs and heavy leather gloves, he transferred the stones one by one into the metal pan sitting in his underground chamber. The stones hissed and cracked slightly as they settled. He lowered the wooden cover into place, feeling it seat firmly against the lip frame. Then he let his fire burn down to coals and eventually die completely. He sat awake through the night, checking the temperature every hour by feel and observation. His breath stayed visible for the first 2 hours, then gradually became less apparent as warmth radiated up through the floorboards. By the 4th hour, the cabin felt noticeably warmer despite the dead fire. By the 6th hour, he could place his hand on the floor directly above the chamber and feel distinct heat. The stones continued radiating warmth for 11 hours before the temperature began dropping noticeably. 11 hours of heat from stones heated for 2 hours. The ratio was better than he had hoped. Word of his strange heating experiment spread through the settlement. Jacob Brennan, passing through on his monthly trading route, stopped at Thomas Hewitt's cabin and heard the full story. Hewitt described the months of work, the obsessive attention to details, the stone collection, the precise joinery, all for a box of hot rocks under the floor. Brennan listened and laughed. He said it reminded him of stories about Samuel Bridger, the trapper who had built fortified cabins out of paranoia about bears. Another mountain man gone strange in the head, building elaborate solutions to problems that didn't need solving. But Ezra continued refining his system through December and into January. He experimented with different numbers of stones. 6 stones provided 11 hours of heat. 8 stones provided 13 hours. 10 stones were difficult to heat thoroughly in his fireplace and provided only marginally longer heat. He settled on 8 as optimal. He adjusted the fit of his cover, planing away tiny amounts of wood where it seated too tightly, adding thin strips where gaps appeared. He tested different arrangements of stones in the metal pan, finding that spacing them slightly apart, rather than packed together, allowed better heat distribution. Thomas Hewitt visited in mid-January and found the cabin comfortably warm with no fire burning. "How long since you had a fire?" Hewitt asked. Ezra said the fire had died 9 hours earlier. Hewitt touched the floor above the chamber, felt the warmth, and shook his head. "It works, but was it worth 3 months of your life?" The winter of 1859 began mild, with light snow in December and temperatures that rarely dropped below 20 degrees. Ezra maintained his routine, heating stones every evening, letting his fire die, sleeping through nights, warmed by radiant heat from below. Augustus had grown accustomed to the process, understanding now that the wooden cover in the floor kept them warm. The boy no longer asked about his mother, but Ezra knew the memory lingered. Every night they survived comfortably was a small victory against the fear that had haunted him since Martha's death. The storm arrived on January 23rd with little warning. The temperature dropped 15 degrees in 2 hours. By afternoon, snow was falling heavily, driven by winds that made standing outside difficult. Ezra recognized the signs. This was not a typical winter storm. This was something worse. He spent the afternoon heating stones, cycling batch after batch through his fireplace until every piece of sandstone he owned was hot. He filled the chamber completely, packed the stones carefully in their metal pan, and lowered the cover into place. Then he built his fire up as large as his fireplace could hold and waited. By evening, the blizzard was in full force. Snow fell so thickly that visibility extended only a few feet. The wind screamed around the cabin, finding every tiny gap, making the shutters rattle. Ezra kept his fire burning through the night, but by morning the wood supply in his cabin was depleted. He needed to go to his woodshed. The temperature outside was brutally cold, far below zero. The wind made it worse. He wrapped himself completely, leaving only his eyes exposed, and pushed out the door. The 20 feet to his woodshed felt like 20 miles. The wind physically pushed him sideways. Snow pelted his face. By the time he reached the shed, his exposed skin was numb. He loaded his arms with wood and fought his way back. Inside, he threw the logs down and stood by his fire, shaking. Augustus watched from the sleeping platform, wrapped in blankets. Ezra knew immediately that he couldn't make many more trips like that. The cold outside was deadly. The storm continued without pause. Day 1 became day 2. Day 2 became day 3. Ezra rationed his wood carefully, making trips to the shed only when absolutely necessary. Each trip was an ordeal. On the 3rd day, he realized his woodshed was nearly empty, and the storm showed no signs of stopping. This was the scenario that had killed Martha. This exact situation, running out of wood while trapped by weather too severe to allow gathering more. On the evening of the 3rd day, Ezra burned his last pieces of wood, building the fire up one final time before it died. He heated another full load of stones, transferred them to the chamber, and sealed the cover. Then he lay down with Augustus under their blankets and waited. The fire burned to coals, then died completely. The cabin grew silent except for the wind outside, but the floor beneath them radiated steady warmth, and the temperature inside never dropped below 55 degrees. The wind stopped on the morning of the 4th day. Ezra woke to silence so complete it seemed unnatural after 3 days of constant howling. He rose carefully, every muscle stiff from cold and tension, and opened his shutters. The world outside was buried. Drifts reached halfway up his cabin walls. The sky was clear and pale blue, but the temperature remained brutally cold. He could see smoke rising from Thomas Hewitt's cabin a quarter-mile away, thin and weak. Ezra touched the floor above his chamber, still warm. The stones had been heating the cabin for 14 hours since his fire died. He checked on Augustus, who was sleeping peacefully under the blankets, and began the work of digging a path to his woodshed. The snow was dense and heavy, packed by the wind. It took him 2 hours to clear a narrow trench the 20 feet to the shed. Once he had access to wood, he built up his fire again and waited to see who would come. Thomas Hewitt arrived late that afternoon, struggling through the deep snow. His face was haggard, his movements exhausted. He pushed through Ezra's door without knocking and stood by the fire, shaking. Ezra poured him coffee and waited. Hewitt finally spoke. "We nearly froze last night. Had to burn our table and 2 chairs to keep the fire going. Ran out of wood yesterday morning. My wife and daughter spent the night huddled by the fireplace burning furniture. Thought we might not make it." Ezra said nothing, just listened. Hewitt looked around the cabin, noted the comfortable temperature, saw Augustus playing quietly, and asked the question, "When did your fire go out?" Ezra said it had died 14 hours earlier, around evening of the previous day. Hewitt stared at him. 14 hours? How is this cabin warm? Ezra walked to the center of the room and lifted the wooden cover from the floor. Heat rose visibly from the chamber below. Hewitt knelt down and looked inside, saw the stones still radiating warmth, and touched the floor around the opening. It was genuinely hot. Ezra explained the entire system, the stone-lined chamber, the thermal mass principle, the carefully fitted cover and lip frame that trapped heat. He explained how 8 stones heated for 2 hours could warm the cabin for 12 to 14 hours, how he could heat stones during the day and sleep through the night without maintaining a fire, how running out of firewood during a blizzard no longer meant death because the stored heat would sustain them. Hewitt listened to every word, occasionally reaching down to touch the stones, feeling the heat that still remained after so many hours. Finally, Hewitt looked at Ezra directly. "That stone box saved your life. All those months we thought you'd lost your mind, tearing up your floor, building fancy frames, heating rocks. You were building something that actually works." Ezra said quietly that it worked because Martha had died without it. Hewitt nodded slowly, understanding. He asked if Ezra would help him build one. Ezra said he would. Word would spread. Others would want them too. He would help anyone who asked. Spring came to the Appalachian highlands in 1859 with the usual rush of melting snow and mud. Ezra spent March and April helping Thomas Hewitt build a heat shaft beneath his cabin floor. Hewitt's construction went faster than Ezra's original because Ezra knew exactly what to do and could guide the work. They completed it in 5 weeks. By May, Silas Crawford had asked for help building one. By summer, Jacob Brennan had spread word through his trading route, and settlers from neighboring valleys were arriving to see the system that had kept Ezra Dalton alive during the blizzard that had nearly killed the Hewitt family. The technique spread organically through the mountain communities. Ezra never promoted it. He simply helped anyone who asked, explaining the principles, showing them how to select stones, how to build the chamber walls, how to construct the lip frame and cover. Some builders modified the design based on available materials. Some used brick instead of stone for the chamber walls. Some built larger chambers that could hold more thermal mass. But the core principle remained the same. A sealed underground vault filled with heated stones that radiated warmth upward for extended periods. Within 2 years, variations of the system were being built throughout the Appalachian settlements from Virginia to Tennessee. People called them different things: Dalton heat shafts, stone vault heating, underground heat chambers. The specific name didn't matter. What mattered was that families who built them survived winters that would have killed them otherwise. The winter of 1860 brought another severe storm, not as intense as the blizzard of '59, but dangerous nonetheless. Cabins with heat shafts maintained livable temperatures even when firewood ran short. Cabins without them suffered, and at least 3 families lost members to hypothermia during that storm. Ezra lived quietly in his mountain cabin with Augustus through the 1860s. The boy grew into a man who understood that his father's obsession had been born from love and loss. Augustus learned to build heat shafts himself and helped construct them for new families moving into the area. By the time the 1870s arrived, the technique was so common in Appalachian settlements that younger residents didn't remember a time before them. They were simply how mountain people survived hard winters. Ezra Dalton died in February 1876 at the age of 54. The cause was a simple accident, a fall on ice that resulted in internal injuries. He was buried next to Martha on the hillside behind his cabin. Augustus and the scattered neighbors attended. No one mentioned the heat shaft innovation during the burial. It wasn't necessary. Everyone standing in that cold February wind owed their presence to cabins warmed by variations of what Ezra had built. The cabins remained long after Ezra was gone. Settlers moving into abandoned homesteads would find the telltale wooden covers in cabin floors and recognize what they meant. Some of these heat shafts continued functioning into the early 1900s, stone chambers still intact, covers still fitting snugly into their lip frames. Silent testimony to what one man's grief and determination had accomplished, not fame or recognition, but something more valuable. The knowledge that spreads because it saves lives, passing from neighbor to neighbor, generation to generation, until the innovation becomes tradition and the inventor becomes forgotten.